Hey, this is Jamie with Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about one of my absolute favorite game mechanisms, and that is increasing action options. Let me give you an example right off the bat so you know what I'm talking about. In Charterstone, if you played Charterstone, this is a village building game that I designed and published through Stonemaier Games. And throughout the game, you are building new action spaces on the board. So at the very beginning of the game of Charterstone, there are maybe 10 action spaces you can take. Six simple ones and a few that are slightly more complex, but they introduce you to core mechanisms of the game. And then by the end of the campaign, the village in Charterstone is filled with action spaces that you can choose from. And I try to do some interesting things with that in terms of the legacy concept. But that's the idea here, that you start out a game, whether it's legacy or not legacy. I focus mostly on not legacy games on this list. You start out with very few action options, and those action options increase as you play the game. A few other examples from our lineup. In Viticulture, specifically the Tuscany Structures expansion, you can build private action spaces that only you can use from then on. So in this video, I'll focus mostly on an increasing number of public actions, but there are some examples here of increasing private actions that you can take over the course of the game. That's Viticulture Tuscany. And in Euphoria, you build markets as you play. You construct these markets that open up new action spaces that do different things throughout the game and impact other players who chose not to build those markets. So that's 3 games from Stonemaier Games that use this mechanism, just as further evidence that I really, really do love this mechanism. So let's jump right into the list, starting with some honorable mentions suggested from me and ambassadors from Stonemaier Games. Those are Anachrony. I've only played it once, so I don't actually remember what the increasing action space mechanism is in Anachrony. Chimera Project. I do remember that one. That's a great game from Tasty Minstrel Games where you are building parts of a spaceship that you or any players can go to over the course of the game. Love that. Caylus. Caylus is a game that very much does this. As players build buildings and open up access to buildings along the road, you have access to more buildings that you can go to, more actions that you can go to. Parks. Parks was right on the edge of this because I really do love Parks. Parks is a one-way action selection track, and the interesting thing that Parks does is that track gets longer as you play the game. So in the last round of the game, I think there are 2 or 3 extra spaces on that track than at the beginning of the game. But it's a very subtle difference. I didn't think it quite qualified for this list. And last, there's Dominion, and games like Dominion, where you can see all your action options, in Dominion, it's more like all the different things that you can buy over the course of the game, but it's also the cards that you get give you different actions. So maybe it should have been a little bit more eligible for this list, but I did put it in honorable mentions. But in Dominion, you are getting more action cards in hand if you're buying action cards, and as you get more money, you have access to buy cards that you didn't earlier in the game. That's a slightly different mechanism here, so I didn't put it on this list. So let's jump right in with number 10, and that is Great Western Trail from the great Alexander Pfister. Great Western Trail has, basically you are herding cattle across the great old West, and then selling those cattle at the end of the trail. And the cattle are cards in your hand. It's kind of a hand management deck building game. And one of the things you can do in the game is build new action spaces on the board that give you better benefits than the action spaces that start printed on the board. Or I think the tiles are actually randomized on the board at the beginning of the game. But you can build new action spaces there. And that influences how quickly you can move throughout the trail because it's adding new action spaces. But it also gives you better benefits that you can gain. You or any other player who uses those action spaces can gain as you play the game. So that's one actually cool mechanism in a couple of these games, that you can have ownership, that you can contribute kind of to the actions that all players have access to. But if you have ownership of that, if you're the one that took your time to make that building, for example, you get benefits whenever any other player or whenever you use that building. So that's my number 10, Great Western Trail. My number 9 is Pandemic Legacy. I wanted to mention one legacy game on this list, and Pandemic Legacy is kind of the marquee game of adding new actions as you play, other than Charterstone. Charterstone does add a ton of actions as you play, action spaces. In Pandemic, you're adding to an action checklist. And it can be a little daunting. So what Megan and I did when we were playing the 2-player campaign of Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is that we added the action stickers, the new action stickers that we got over the course of the campaign. We added them to the back of another action mat, so we could always see all of the actions faced up in front of us. It's one of the very few like component design flaws, I think, in Pandemic, that your action checklist is double-sided, so you can only ever see half the actions that you have access to. That's not good component design for action checklists. You should be able to see all of them all the time. But Pandemic Legacy still adds, I like how you start out with core pandemic actions and then you increase the action options over the course of the game. And you only ever have to pay attention to some of them. In certain games, based on the objectives, you don't have to look at any certain actions at all, whereas in other games you do. So that's number 9, Pandemic Legacy, specifically Season 0. That's my favorite Pandemic Legacy. At number 8 is Orleans. Orleans does this in a few different ways, and it is more of a private, in addition to private action spaces. One is the buildings that you can make in Orleans. They increase the number of the action spaces that you have access to for your workers. That's great. And that's, I would say, the main connection to this mechanism. The other aspect, though, is in Orleans, based on your starting workers, there are, I think, almost half the actions on your player mat that you just don't have access to at all yet because you don't have the workers to place there. So I like that you start off with really very few options in Orleans, and based on the workers you gain access to new action spaces on your player mat. So 2 different ways that Orleans does it. I think does it very well, increases your action options, and that's why it's my number 8 game in this category. Raiders of the North Sea does this in a really clever thematic way. In Raiders of the North Sea, all players start off in a village at the base of the board with, I think, maybe 5 or 6 different actions that they can choose from. And then at a certain point in the game, when you've developed your horde of Vikings to a certain point, and you know how to build ships, then you can sail across the river, the sea, to a new land, and that new land has a ton of other action spaces that you can take and use and pillage and plunder, as Vikings traditionally do. And so I think that's a great way to do it. So all the actions are printed on the board right from the beginning of the game. And you can see them. You can see these things that you can someday go to, but they are separated by this big body of water in the art on the board, which I think is a really nice thematic touch. And then when you're ready, you can venture across that water if you're able to do so. I just think that's a really clever aspect of the game. That you start off with very few actions at the base of the board, but you can see your future. You can see all these actions that you can get to when you are eligible to start using those actions. So that is Raiders of the North Sea. At number 6, we have Beyond the Sun. Beyond the Sun is a game where you are building essentially a shared tech tree, but it's only shared if you yourself have researched any given technology. And so there is in Beyond, so you're building this shared tech tree, but the unshared part of it is that you don't know what the next card will be in the tech tree. You don't see it at the beginning of the game. You only see the very beginnings of this tech tree. And so if you are the first player to research or discover something, you have a little bit of a choice. You kind of get to choose the direction of that tree. You get a special bonus for being the first player to access that part of the tree. But all other players don't get access to that new technology yet. They can see it, they know what it is, and they can decide if that's important to them or not. And if they do, they can use an action to research it, to gain access to it themselves. And then they have an action space, an action that they can use for the rest of the game in this tech tree format. It is a really cool implementation of this increasing action option mechanism. I love tying that into a tech tree itself, and I would love to actually see that in other games too, although Beyond the Sun does it incredibly well. I just think that's a fantastic example of this. And one of the other things I wanted to mention with Beyond the Sun, and a few games that will follow here, I think it makes the onboarding process into a game really, really easy if you start out with very few options and then increase them organically over the course of the game. Beyond the Sun does this incredibly well. If you started the game with all of those action options available on the board, even if you don't have the ability to access them yet, but you're just looking at them and kind of deciding your path, it would be really daunting at the beginning of the game, and it would increase the setup time as well. But by slowly introducing them over the course of the game, you avoid that and you onboard new and players who haven't played in a while in a much more relaxed manner. That's Beyond the Sun, my number 6. At number 5, I cheated a little bit. I put 2 games together. I put Agricola and Caverna together at number 5. And Agricola and Caverna, kind of similar to Beyond the Sun, but outside of players' control. Every time you advance into a new round, you reveal a new action that all players have access to. And so the game itself kind of slow rolls the action revealing process. So instead of players having the ability to add new actions to the game itself is adding new action options over the course of the game in terms of action spots, action spaces on the board in Agricola and Caverna. But I think this is kind of the grandfather of all these, except for one game that's a little bit older that I'll mention in a second. But it does it so well. It does it so super, super well. I think it was really clever of Uwe Rosenberg to think of this and not to throw all those actions out at players right from the beginning of the game. So that's Agricola and Caverna at number 5. At number 4 is one of the few games that's not worker placement on this list, and that is Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering does this really, really well in terms of activated abilities. In Magic the Gathering, there are certain cards that you're playing that have activated abilities that are essentially new actions that you can take once you have those cards in play. So I think this is a great way to do it, to have this increasing action opportunity. At the beginning of a game of Magic, you have no cards in play. You just have cards in hand. And so you're playing cards, and some of those cards might have activated abilities that add action options, new ways to spend your mana during the game to do things. Not all of them are exactly new actions, but they all end up, like, some of them just like impact the strength of a creature or something like that. But in the end, it is a new way to spend your mana that is not available at the beginning of the game, and that it does generally increase over the course of the game. So that's why Magic the Gathering is number 4 on this list of increasing action options. At number 3 is one of the newest games on this list, and that is The Lost Ruins of Arnak. In this game, one of the things I thought was brilliant as I was playing it is that you start off at base camp and you have access to a few options at base camp, as well as some cards you can buy, a research track. There are a couple different actions available to you at the beginning of the game. But there's also this untamed wilderness, undiscovered wilderness that no one has gone out and ventured to yet. And you don't know what's there. And so as players venture out there and discover new locations, you open up those locations as action spots for all players to have access to. And they add another layer on top of that because at each location is a guardian, a monster that is guarding this location that you can either choose to deal with or not. And there is a nice benefit if you are the one to actually take care of the guardian that's there. But I just love that how the theme in this game in particular is tied to the mechanisms, because it would not be as thematic in an exploration game if you could look out at the board and see everything that's there right from the beginning of the game. Instead, in Lost Ruins of Arnak, you discover what's out there as you play, and what you discover become action spots for all players to have access to over the course of the game. So that's why Lost Ruins of Arnak is my number 3 on this list. At number 2 is another slight cheat here, because it's 2 games that use the exact same mechanism in very different games, and those are Concordia and Flotilla. Both of these games use an action card system where you start off the game with, I believe, around 5 or 6 cards in hand, and each of those cards represents an action. And so on your turn, you'll take one of those cards, you'll discard it, and you'll take the action on that card. It's a really nice way to onboard players into the game because you give them all their action options right close to them where they can actually read them and take their time and see which ones they want to take. And over the course of these games, you can acquire new cards that open up new options. Some of them are just better versions of the actions that you previously had in your hand, but some of them are new things that you couldn't do at the beginning of the game. So I love this process. So instead of using action spaces like these worker placement games I mentioned, they use cards. They use cards as actions and let you access and bring new cards into your hand to increase your action options over the course of the game. So at the end of the game of Concordia Flotilla, you might have many more cards in hand than you did at the beginning of the game. But at that point, you are ready for that mental overload because you have chosen them, you've added them to your hand, you're ready to handle all those choices. I said that Agricola and Caverna is kind of the grandfather of these games, but the number 1 game on my list, I think, is almost the true game, the true example of this, and that is Lords of Waterdeep. Because in Lords of Waterdeep, this is the game that I always think of when I think of this increasing action options mechanism. One of the things that you can do in the game is build a structure. So it's your choice. When you're ready to do it, you can build a structure if you have access to that action space, and that structure goes on the game board, a building. It's a structure building, same thing. And any player can place a worker there if no other workers are there to gain the building's benefit. And there's a few really cool things in play here because one, you're like I've said here, you are starting out with a few core actions and expanding that over the course of the game. So you're starting out players very easily, and then you're increasing their options in an organic way over the course of the game with players choosing how to do it instead of like an Agricola and Caverna where the game is doing it for you. Two, one thing I mentioned earlier is if you are the one to build that building, you get a benefit when any other player uses that building, which is great. I like that little touch. And three, in terms of the economy of the game, the buildings that players decide to build completely change the economy of the game. The economy starts off very simple. Like you can look at the board and say, okay, one worker gets me 2 black cubes, one worker gets me 2 orange cubes, but one worker only gives me 1 purple cube or 1 white cube. And so you know that economy of black cubes are easier to get than purple cubes at the beginning of the game. But over the first few turns of the game, players might build a few structures that make it much easier to get purple cubes. So suddenly, the economy is different than it was at the beginning of the game, and different from any other game played before Lords of Waterdeep, because suddenly this is how the economy works. Purple cubes are a lot easier to get now. I think they're like mages in the game or wizards. But I love that, how it changes the economy. I love how it expands over the course of the game. I love how it feels good to build a building, whether or not you end up actually using it. On every level, I think Lords of Waterdeep does this mechanism of increasing action options incredibly well, and that's why it's my number 1 game on this list. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, what your top 3 games of this kind are. If you can think of any of their games that increase your action options over the course of the game that I've totally forgotten, perhaps in completely different ways than I've mentioned here, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them in the comments below. Thanks.